This is the Brave New Coin Crypto Conversation, hosted by Andy Pickering.
Hi everyone, Andy Pickering here. I'm your host and welcome to the Crypto Conversation, a Brave New Coin podcast where we talk to the people building the future in the Bitcoin, blockchain and cryptocurrency space. Hello everyone, Andy Pickering here, and we have a very good show for you today. But before we get into it, need to shout out our new sponsor, Nexo. Yes indeed, are you ready to grow your wealth with the world's leading digital assets institution, Nexo? Well, you should be ready, because you can earn up to 12% on your digital assets with Nexo's high yield savings account. That's right. So treat yourself, treat your crypto, and treat your fiat with the industry's best crypto and fiat services, which include compounding interest paid out daily. There are 18 available cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, various stablecoins, and many more. And 3 fiat currencies are accepted, the euro, the pound, and USD. And Nexo has up to $375 million worth of insurance across all custodial assets. Top-ups and withdrawals are available at any time, and there are 0 fees for using the Nexo Earn Suite. So, are you ready to start earning? Of course you are. Simply go to nexo.io, and of course that is spelt NEXO.io. And now it's on with the show. My guest today is Jamie Burke. Jamie is the founder and CEO of Outlier Ventures, and Jamie and Outlier are passionate proponents of what they call the Open Metaverse thesis, which explores how the Web 3.0 stack extends beyond financial services into virtual worlds, gaming, decentralized commerce, and much more. Welcome to the show, Jamie.
Hey, Andy. Thanks for having me on.
Look, Jamie, it's a pleasure. I'm excited to talk to you today. I'm one of many people increasingly fascinated by the metaverse, and it's been fascinating to see, people and crypto and sci-fi fans. I guess we've always had this idea of what the metaverse is, but in the last 12 months or so, it's really starting to seep out into the wider public consciousness, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, as you say, of course, the metaverse is historically grounded in science fiction like Snow Crash and Ready Player One, but I think has really begun to become part of, I guess, wider discourse in the kind of technological sense as we're looking into virtual worlds, as you said, gaming environments, and I guess really as a point of reflection on what COVID has kind of accelerated. And so, but I imagine, as we'll get into this over the course of the podcast, at the same time, I don't think there's really a unifying definition of it. I certainly have mine or kind of that of Outliers as an institution. But, I think many people will tell you, the metaverse isn't here yet. It needs certain innovations to have happened at scale. I would argue that the metaverse is here and now, and not some distant point in the future, which is why it's even more important that we begin to think about the direction we want it to take.
Oh, that is exactly right. And I think that's a great point to kick off with, Jamie. But I suppose just before we do that, I think it would be good just to learn just a little bit about yourself. So maybe just as a way of introduction, would love it if you could introduce yourself and I guess, what you and your team are doing at Outlier.
Yeah, so the short story is we've been investing broadly in what we've been calling up until now Web3, which effectively is looking at applications of blockchain technologies to a variety of use cases, both including fintech, financial services, cryptocurrencies, but also beyond that into the new data economy, how it can enable for privacy enhancing technologies, and can extend to everything from a more decentralized cloud architecture, from compute to storage, and pretty much extend across the web. And so I guess the distinction there is, as Web 2 to Web 3, Web 2 is dominated by a handful of platform monopolies, owned, controlled by some corporations, which effectively prioritize shareholder supremacy over the user. And Web3 kind of flips that on its head and is focused much more around the sovereignty of the individual, the user, and concepts like sovereign identity, self-sovereign identity, and sovereign wealth. And that extends to all forms of wealth. So that's money, but it's also data. And as we begin to think about that in the context of the metaverse, which we'll unpack a little bit later, all other forms of digital wealth. So, we've been doing that since 2013, and our thesis has kind of really evolved with the market as this Web3 technology stack gets built out, which is effectively made up of several open protocols, and that broadly allow for permissionless usage and permissionless innovation. And so we've, in the early days, when there weren't really startups to invest in per se, we focused much more lower down in that stack, in the Web3 stack, at the kind of protocol layer, infrastructure, effectively, tooling for developers to make dApps, decentralized applications. As that stack matured, we moved up the stack into kind of middleware. So things that resembled businesses, sometimes decentralized, sometimes actual equity-based businesses that made that stack more usable, more widely usable in a developer context. And as there's now more infrastructure and more middleware, it becomes more usable. We're starting to see it applied to more and more use cases. And so we've now been able to focus increasingly at the application layer. So as this technology gets applied to particular industries, particular use cases. And so throughout that journey, we've transitioned really from an incubator, working in multi-year engagement on very technical projects, up that stack into, we're now an accelerator effectively. So for the last, COVID's always confused me with timelines, I think 3 years now, just under 3 years. We've condensed all of that learning into an accelerator. And as a consequence, we're nearing our 100th startup this fall. And we're now at a scale where we'll be accelerating at least 100 startups every year within this Web3 categorization, and increasingly Web3 applied, as you said in the intro, to what we call the metaverse, allowing for a more open metaverse.
Yes, indeed, Jamie. So, you and your team, you've, as I said, you are passionate proponents of what you call the Open Metaverse thesis. And so I guess, you mentioned this as well, that different people have different definitions or different mental models of what they think the metaverse is and isn't. So yeah, would love to just get your thoughts on how you go about kind of framing up what the metaverse is, and I suppose where we are, on the metaverse timeline.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, the latter point is perhaps harder, but I'll try and address the former first to define what I mean anyway when I say the metaverse, and then this framework for assessing openness and why that's important. And then maybe between us, we can think about where that puts us on a possible timeline.
Sounds good.
So if you kind of go back and, as I said, you look to the origins of the metaverse as a concept, in things like Snow Crash. Snow Crash, I believe, was the first book where it was referenced. And if you kind of look at the consistent theme that connects both that and, I guess, future references of the metaverse, for me anyway, there seems to be one unifying theme. And that is primarily that the metaverse is somehow an economic system that enjoys supremacy to the nation state, or a nation state, and kind of fiat-based economic systems. And in the context of Ready Player One, for example, this is an economic system that a single corporation is trying to take control of, very close to taking control of. And ultimately what that means is that they can define the rules of the metaverse. And those are, the kind of principal economic rules. It is who can participate in this economic system. They control currency supply. They ultimately can control who can participate, on what terms, the kind of T's and C's. And so, putting aside the technology for a second and just looking at that principle, for me, that is kind of the unifying principle. And science fiction has typically said that it is a dystopic process of capture and control, effectively. And Ready Player One's a good example of that. It's a single corporation trying to capture and control that unifying economic system. There is a meta economy. It kind of sits above everything else. And I'll come back to that point a little bit later, but principally that is why we believe it needs to be an open economic system. And that's why we believe all of this technology that we've been developing for the last decade now, in the context of Web3 or crypto, it is critically important. And in fact, the thing that makes the metaverse possible today. So a lot of people will say, well, the metaverse doesn't exist yet because there isn't this economic system. And I would argue that economic system exists. It's just not been integrated or adopted into instances, all the instances, or even the majority of instances of the metaverse. I think it's also important to make the distinction that, again, in my mind, and as best as I could research, there is one metaverse, hence it being meta, the metaverse. But there could be many instances of it, and I would call those verses. But there is a metaverse that sits above it, and the metaverse should be the single unifying economic system that sits above it. Now, in terms of the technology mix, the other important thing about the metaverse, based upon science fiction, and I would argue, holds today, is that the metaverse needs to be both virtual, but also physical. It needs to blur those two realities to the point they become indistinguishable from one another. So, some people will say, well, that means you must have these 3D VR environments and that must be totally persistent. Or some people will say, well, that means we need AR, glasses on to have this kind of constant virtual overlay on the physical world. I wouldn't be as specific as that, but what I would say is that the metaverse must bridge both the physical and the virtual. And again, for me, the most important point there is on the economic one. Although, of course, you could say that the metaverse is deepened, the more ubiquitous we can experience in our lives, whether it's work, play, education, or social. Other people will say, well, actually, they would regard, Web 2 social media as part of the metaverse, and I would say that's largely true. But again, I think that the missing piece here is that if there isn't some unifying economic system, then I don't believe it can be truly a metaverse. And then the kind of final point I would say on that is that if you reflect on this idea that the metaverse in science fiction's imagination was this dystopic process of capture and control, that it could be controlled by a single corporation, then that sounds a lot like the web today. It sounds a lot like the first instances of the metaverse or its verses in environments like Fortnite or Oculus. So whether it's gaming environments, whether it's like, you know, Epic and Unreal, whether it's social experiences in the Oculus headset, the reality is those are controlled by single corporations that still prioritize shareholders over users. I think increasingly people are aware of that in a Web 2 context. The only difference is that as we begin to attach these devices to our heads, you know, the data collection that effectively is the bedrock of Web 2 today literally goes inside us. The biometric data it collects, if it's a VR headset, you know, it can see your retinal response to visual stimuli that you're not even aware of. You also, with an Oculus headset, scan the 3D interior of your home. And so this is why, for me, it becomes really important that we start to think about, well, who owns and controls the metaverse? What principles is it built on? And at least for my part, you know, I would fight violently to make sure that the Web 2 business model is not extended into the metaverse, which is basically, it's free, but as long as we can harvest your data and we can effectively elect what we do with it, we can change the T's and C's. And of course, it's no surprise that also, you know, Facebook understand with their attempts and efforts with Libra, the role of cryptocurrency, the role of having a meta economy that sits above all this stuff as well. So hence why I think it's important to reflect and discuss open versus closed, as binary as that might sound. And I guess we're going to get into the nuance of that later.
Yes. And look, lots to unpack there, Jamie, but 2 points I suppose I would make. I'm sure you've read, essays by Matthew Ball, who's a fantastic writer on all things metaverse, and, you know, two of the I guess, preconditions for what he describes as a metaverse. You've kind of alluded to this as well, is that a metaverse never resets or pauses or ends. It's just an ongoing living experience, whether you kind of dip in or out. And the other thing he talks about is, you know, this idea of unprecedented interoperability, which of course is, you know, very common in crypto and blockchain worlds, as kind of also a defining feature, because eventually we need all these bits to be able to interact with each other, you know, seamlessly or not. And interesting also, Jamie, you know, you're talking about this idea of open and closed platforms. And so Fortnite's a good example. And I think on the Outlier website, you have a great quote from Tim Sweeney, he's the CEO of Epic, I think. And he said that the metaverse is going to be far more pervasive and powerful than anything else. And if one central company was to gain control of this, they will become more powerful than any government and be a god on earth. So with that in mind, then, Jamie, I'd love it if you could sort of give us, your context as to why it's important that we don't have like a Ready Player One style dystopian metaverse where there's one kind of evil corporation in control. And if that's the bad version of the metaverse, how do we get to a more open, I guess, decentralized world? What are the pieces of the puzzle that need to come together to try and work towards that outcome?
Yeah, and it's great that you referenced the Tim Sweeney quote, because actually, if you think about that for a second, I mean, this is a man who has the most to gain from
Yes.
closed metaverse, in theory, right? You know, so
Yeah.
there is a duopoly of gaming engine at the moment. And, he effectively owns and controls one of them. And gaming engines are now being extended well beyond games. Movies are being created, virtual worlds are being built, well beyond what you might classically understand or define as a game.
A good example of that, Jamie, is The Mandalorian. That was created on one of the gaming engines. All the special effects, they just, amazing.
Exactly, right. So these are, I actually think gaming engine is a bit misleading. These are world builders, and he owns one of the two world builders that are dominating the metaverse at the moment. And there's very little to indicate that there is a contender at the moment to that duopoly. Now, for him to say that is interesting. And alongside that, they just announced $1 billion fund. They just put in $1 billion worth of new money specifically to help enable an open metaverse. And that's both in the context of their organization and their gaming engine. But we also have had dealings with Epic, with our accelerator. They're actively support through grants. I think they're also doing investments, but definitely grants, projects that are building in the decentralized space. So of course, you could never guarantee the intentions of any one corporation in this space, but they certainly seem to be putting their money where their mouth is. And most interestingly, Tim Sweeney actually commented when we released the Open Metaverse OS. We shared it on Twitter. He actually commented on it and said he found it very interesting. So, I think, so why is he saying that? Why is he concerned, perhaps, at his own company's success? And again, if you go back to Ready Player One, well, I'm sure it's no surprise that he remembers the reason why that story plays out is because the company has superseded its founder, its creator. He understands he is mortal, but corporations live on, and a corporation that is as powerful as his, where perhaps he's not around to guarantee it sticks to the course that perhaps he would like it to stay on, could be very dangerous. And so he's already making sure that he's creating the direction of travel for both his company, but the wider industry, to enable, as you say, kind of a more open system that's more interoperable. And by the way, I actually think that will help him make his shareholders richer. I don't think the two are at odds. But that said, he could have taken a very different direction there. So I think it's really interesting to see what Tim's saying and what he's doing over there at Epic and Unreal. But then to your point around, well, how do we make this open? Well, so, open and closed is a little bit binary. It's, of course, the world is never that simple. Just like, for a long time now, people have been talking about decentralized or centralized in crypto, which is, it has meaning, but in many cases, it's a bit of a blunt object, and an organization can be very decentralized, or a network can be very decentralized in some ways and incredibly centralized in others. And I would argue that they probably should. You should have different design configurations for different use cases, depending on what you're optimizing for. And also the stage of development of the network. Centralization generally benefits a network when it's trying to find network market fit, and it needs to iterate. You don't want to decentralize governance in that too early. That said, if you're working in DeFi, decentralized finance, given the increased regulatory hostility that most projects are facing at the moment, and operators within that network, then it's probably in your benefit to be as decentralized as possible from day one, so you become censorship resistant. So, and so the same is true with open, right? There are pros and cons for open, and it is also multi-dimensional. And I also think there's another distinction. It's not so critical to understanding the open metaverse, but I do think it's important enough to stress, which is, if you can, and we have this illustrated in something called the Open Metaverse OS, as in the Open Metaverse operating system. It's a paper you can download on our website at outlierventures.io. It's in the research section. But broadly, if you wanted a very simplistic way of mapping the metaverse at the moment, you could have open and closed on one axis and high tech and low tech on the other. And the reason why I think it's important to have high tech and low tech is because if we agree that actually what defines the metaverse, or at least the open metaverse, is that there is some common open economic system that unites all of these verses, then we have to think about financial inclusion. Now, if you are at the high-tech end of the spectrum, like Oculus, for example, you are really pushing the boundaries, both in hardware and software, of the experience of the metaverse, making this very deep, immersive VR experience. And of course, that's great. That's wonderful. We want people to push that. We want to make it more immersive. And we want to be able to blur the boundary of experience between something that is obviously digital or not real and something that we might regard as reality. But at the same time, if the headset costs you several £100 and actually even now for Oculus to do certain things, you need to plug it into a gaming PC, well, that could be another couple of grand. Like most people are not going to have the capital to join that economic system, to have that experience. So you need for a low-tech instance of the metaverse, ideally as low as possible, in order that as many people on the planet can begin to participate in the metaverse, because to be excluded from it is to be excluded from, what will become the single largest economy and probably the single most important place of work and everything else and social inclusion.
Yeah, and just to kind of, if listeners need an example of what you mean, Jamie, by low tech, what you're really talking about is a classic example is quite simply Roblox, which any 5-year-old or 10-year-old can play on their iPad. A lot of 5 to 10-year-olds have iPads these days, even if they are the kind of the hand-me-downs from the older brothers and sisters. Or another example might be a kind of a blockchain game on a smartphone, right? That's kind of what you mean by low tech. So you don't need VR or AR or anything like that. You actually just do need an internet connection, but you can still access that community and potential economy of other people, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So the best example I would give of open and low tech. So the most open and the most low tech would be crypto voxels. So that is very deliberately highly voxelated world. It's a bit like Minecraft. I would say even less sophisticated than Minecraft. But you can play it on a smartphone. Now, of course, that still precludes, I believe, the majority of humanity. I don't know what percentage terms, but it's definitely at least over 50% of the global population still don't have a smartphone, or at least to the specification where that would work. But nevertheless, we can imagine over time that will be the case. And so you're absolutely right. The ability to, as long as you have a basic piece of hardware and an internet connection, then you can begin to participate in this system. And of course, there's another layer to that, which is you might have free to play, for example. So you don't have to pay to join the system. This is one of the big criticisms of blockchain-based games, because things happen on chain, there is an immediate economic cost to enter the system. But of course, once you're in there, you can generate an income. However, through something called play to earn. However, that said, I know many projects that are working on this now, where effectively the new users can join the system without an upfront cost, effectively subsidized through the network growth by them launching their own tokens and virtual economies and stuff. But get a bit sidetracked into that. But it is an important distinction, and I think it's something that we should make foundational to how we are rolling out the metaverse.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's. I want to bring it back slightly to, I guess, a blockchain context or a decentralized context, Jamie. So, one of the things you talked about even before this sort of Open Metaverse thesis is a thesis from a few years ago, which you called the Convergence Thesis, and that just simply means, technologies like VR, AR, AI, Internet of Things, just technology trends all slowly maturing and coming closer together, which is how we get to things like the metaverse. But I suppose the blockchain equivalent is, and you talk about this as well, I think something like the Web3 toolbox for the open metaverse, right? So this is more like blockchain ideas such as a DeFi, decentralized finance, NFTs, decentralized governance, and self-sovereign identity. So tell us a little bit about what you mean by this idea of, I guess, a Web3 toolbox, and how all these decentralized platforms all start to provide different parts of the toolkit for the open metaverse.
Yes, you're absolutely right to reference the Convergence Thesis. That, I guess, that was the precursor to the Metaverse, Open Metaverse Thesis. And as you say, I mean, effectively, what we're now saying is that the convergence of those technologies is what creates the metaverse, it's into the metaverse. But previously, what we recognized fairly early on in our evolution at Outlier Ventures and our thesis about how we would invest in blockchain was that you couldn't look at blockchain in isolation. For you to fully understand the value that would be created on blockchains, you had to look how it converged with other technologies. And so, yes, that included VR and AR. Actually, what quite rightly we flagged would come first or sooner was really this data component. Blockchains effectively are good at organizing data. They're good at commodifying that data. And of course, that data can then represent value. That could be, a fungible token, a non-fungible token. And those can be associated to any other forms of value. So again, like that data component was always critical to our thinking, and that's bled into our understanding of the open metaverse is, well, who owns and controls the data, the associated data, the metadata. But the kind of more fundamental applications or primitives that blockchains enable in the context of the metaverse and an open metaverse is this ledger of account. And on this ledger of account, the ability to both automate what happens on it, through logic, which comes through smart contracts, and the ability to create a digital scarcity. So, which is a huge innovation, if you think about it, in the history of the internet, where something can, for the first time, be both digital and scarce. And that then manifests in two ways. One is a fungible use case, one is a non-fungible use case. Of course, now NFTs, non-fungible tokens, are all the rage, and rightfully so. But effectively, if we're talking about a fungible token, it is things that are effectively fairly divisible. So it could be currencies, a really good example of that. You don't really care which dollar you've got in your pocket as long as it's a dollar. Just like you don't care what whether it's which liter of gas or petrol you've got in your car. Each unit is almost equal to one another, or equivalent to one another. Whilst with a non-fungible token, effectively, this is something where its provenance is important. It is unique and distinct from the other tokens in some way. And that can be as simple as just being a digital print, for example, of a piece of art. It's just number one of 50 that are printed. Or it can have much kind of greater uniqueness and characteristics baked into it. But effectively, those primitives, the ledger, the smart contracts, fungible and non-fungible tokens, these are the things that have enabled a decade's worth of innovation to happen, of applying that into creating decentralized networks that are coordinated and often secured bottom up in a permissionless environment. So, Bitcoin's obviously the most famous example, where there's now billions of dollars of mining rigs all around the world that are put to work in a totally permissionless way to secure the Bitcoin network, because of the incentives built in to how the Bitcoin network was designed, where people effectively get paid to mine. And so people have applied different game theoretics to coordinating different types of networks to deliver different types of value. And so each one of these now gives you kind of a specialized protocol, which solves for a highly specialized coordination problem, but in aggregate, in combination, can form this Web3 stack. So to bring that to life, you could look at something like Filecoin, where Filecoin effectively has taken all those principles that we mentioned about Bitcoin, but the particular coordination problem they're solving is how do you allow for a form of decentralized data storage without a kind of an AWS. And there is an equivalent for compute with a network called Kudos. And in combination, they're both solving, one solving storage, one solving compute. In combination, they allow for a decentralized form of cloud. And that's just one example of how two things combine. They run independently, they're composable, which means you could, in theory, swap one out for the other. And then, they kind of build into a kind of a wider stack of technologies. And so when you begin to apply these in the context of the metaverse, that metaverse becomes open. Now, so you could just leverage blockchain technologies and the protocols that exist to have a more decentralized form of cloud, which, so why would you do that? Well, it becomes censorship resistant, it becomes unstoppable. AWS couldn't pull the plug on you if they didn't like you for whatever reason. Or you can kind of move further up the stack. And so there are examples of people that are creating decentralized gaming engines to kind of rival the likes of Unreal. There are people that have bundled together different applications and middleware technologies that are on top of Ethereum, for example, and created NFT minting platforms like OpenSea, which is both an environment where you can issue and mint NFTs, but also freely trade them in this kind of open secondary market. There are people that have created entire virtual worlds leveraging this technology, for example, Decentraland, or what I mentioned earlier, crypto voxels. Now, for every implementation of a verse leveraging this Web3 architecture, the creators have different design choices. It can be, what is the underlying currency of that world, or how is virtual land? What are the rules behind a virtual land? How scarce is it? How is it sold? You can have rules about transferability, and I think this is one of the really critical points for me for the open metaverse is today the majority of value that exists in what you might call the metaverse in any one verse, such as Fortnite or any other game, is non-transferable, i.e., in the platform that you buy it, you can't sell it off that platform. It's basically trapped in that platform. Now, sometimes you can't even resell it in that platform. Sometimes you can, but you can never transfer it. And that is actually the opposite to what happens in the NFT space, for example. So the NFT, I would argue, the NFT industry at the moment is the best example of the open metaverse to date, because almost every NFT platform where you can mint an NFT, i.e. create one, issue one, sell one, but most importantly, buy one, it can be transferred off that platform and it can be freely resold. And so, for example, I might buy an NFT on Nifty Gateway, but once I bought it, it's mine. It's in my wallet, and I can then move it to any other wallet, including wallets off the Nifty Gateway platform, and I can freely sell it permissionlessly in any other platform that it accepts the standard of which NFTs are based on. And so that's kind of like, but almost by default in the NFT world, but does not exist almost anywhere else. And so not only can it not be transferred and resold, but you mentioned earlier something called DeFi, decentralized finance. So that's when people have effectively created applications on top of primarily Ethereum today, the Ethereum blockchain, where you can borrow and lend assets, digital assets. They can be fungible or non-fungible. And the distinction of DeFi is currently that it's permissionless. There's often not a platform in the way. You can freely borrow and lend. Now, with NFTs, once I've moved it off this platform, not only can I sell it to other people, but in theory, I can now use it as collateral. I can put that as collateral to work to earn me an income. I could take out a loan against that collateral. So it is truly an open financial system, and that now extends not just to currency or stable coins, which is what originally drove or fueled DeFi, but now it extends to all NFTs. And if you imagine the range of use cases for NFTs, that becomes almost limitless. And so if you remember earlier, I was saying that one of the really important principles around the open metaverse is that it should be based upon financial inclusion. Now, if you think about how many billions of value is currently trapped in gaming platforms, which might actually be the primary or only form of wealth that particular user might have, especially for younger generations. Currently, not only can they not divest from a platform, okay, I'm fed up with this game, I've invested all this time, maybe money in playing it, but you know what, I'm bored, I want to move on to a different game. You can't, that's it. All the value you've created is trapped there. But worse than that, try and walk into a bank and get a loan or a mortgage for a house based on your $1 million worth of Fortnite skins, or weapons. Not going to happen. But in DeFi, that is possible. As long as there is a group of people that can price the asset that you've got, then you will be able to borrow and lend against it. Now, the rates might be that good, but you will be able to borrow and lend against it. And so I would argue that the open metaverse represents an opportunity for almost complete financial inclusion, again, assuming you've got the device to join and participate. And given that increasing amounts of value are digital, I think this becomes critical. And the reason why I think people like Tim Sweeney get this is we don't have huge samples yet, but what we do know is people spend 5 times more in blockchain games than conventional games. And by the way, I think Axie Infinity is now generating more revenue than any game on the planet. I think it's doing 150 million a month through its play to earn game mechanic. And the reason is because people are more prepared to invest more time and money in a blockchain game because they know it's an investment and they can recoup funds. They can transfer out of it. They can borrow and lend against it. And so very quickly, all these gaming companies are going to realize, shit, people will spend more money in our games if we allow for transferability. But it's a big head shift that they need to kind of get their head around.
Yeah, so I think Fortnite and Axie Infinity, they're just such two good examples here for a multitude of reasons, really, Jamie. But, you know, the two big ones, I guess, that you've kind of hinted at or explained, really, is, you know, it just doesn't make sense for a young kid today. They might start playing Fortnite around, say, you know, 8 or 9 years old, and they could really stick with the game if they get into it. And you know, I know people that have done this, you know, for a decade, really. And if you think of the amount of hours that they would put into Fortnite across a decade, and the sort of the skill level, you know, the skill level that their avatar or Fortnite identity would build up, and the kind of the skins and weapons that you accumulate, yeah, there's got to be some kind of real world value put on that kind of effort. And yeah, of course, you know, Axie Infinity, you're right, it's just exploded this year, and yeah, incredible to see people using Axie to earn an income, really, in places like the Philippines. But man, Jamie, we're almost at an hour, and I really want to finish off with the crypto conversation hot take round with you, because I think that will be a little bit of fun. So I reckon we go to a very quick break, and then we'll come back and finish off with the very famous crypto conversation hot take round.
Grow your wealth with the world's leading digital assets institution, Nexo. Earn up to 12% on your digital assets with Nexo's high-yield savings account. Treat yourself, your crypto and fiat with the industry-best crypto and fiat services, featuring compounding interest paid out daily, 18 available cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, stablecoins, and more. 3 fiat currencies are accepted: Euro, Pounds, and USD. Up to $375 million insurance on all custodial assets, top-ups and withdrawals available at any time, and 0 fees for using Nexo Earn Suite. Start earning at nexo.io. That's nexo.io.
All right, we're back, and I'm with Jamie Burke, who is, of course, the founder and CEO of Outlier Ventures. We've really been talking everything Metaverse today. But Jamie, I like to finish each podcast with a quick round of rapid fire crypto conversation hot takes. Are you up for it?
I think so.
Don't worry, you'll be fine. Quick, snappy answers, Jamie. Hot take round, here we go. Jamie, where would you say that you sit on the Bitcoin maximalist to multi-coin opportunist spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, I to be honest, I think if you're a Bitcoin maxi, you're a moron. So how about that? I mean, I just think to honestly think that the innovation of digital scarcity could only be applied in one instance is just insane, especially when it was deliberately created to be open source. But secondly, because anybody that knows about game theory knows that, and system engineering, systems design, knows that you try to solve for the most simplest design. You know, so as a byproduct of that, you clearly need lots of specialized protocols to enable a complete full Web3 stack.
Yep. Good answer, Jamie. It makes sense when you put it like that. Well, look, Bill Gates famously said that we tend to overestimate what we can accomplish in 2 years and underestimate what we can accomplish in 10. So, you know, anything you like here, but Metaverse is probably the best one. What does it look like in 10 years' time?
Wow. Honestly, it's really difficult to say.
It is.
You know, what I do know is that the more open it becomes, the more accelerated it becomes, the more convergent all of these technologies, And so, I'm seeing innovations in agent-based systems, for example, which can allow for worlds populated with greater levels of intelligence, more kind of AI-based individuals and characters, rather than just people. It's kind of going to be this interplay between people and agents and agent-based systems. At the same time, I think that if you look at something like Oculus at the moment, there aren't that many games on it. There's not that much content being built on it because there's not much incentive to do that, right? And so again, I think the Open Metaverse gives a shot in the arm, bringing in, increasing amounts of revenue into these environments if they open up, that can fund greater and greater innovation at the hardware layer. And so the more open we become, the better the hardware, the more immersive, the more persistent, and the greater the economic incentive for people to join and participate. So, the bigger the population.
Yes, indeed. Very nice. Well, similarly, actually, Jamie, so, sci-fi author William Gibson said, and you'll be very aware of this quote, that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. Can you think of an example of the future being here right now, but most people just aren't really aware of it?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, as most of your listeners probably know by now, last week, I don't want to date this, but Facebook announced that they are transitioning to become a metaverse company rather than a social media company.
Yes.
That is not a new thing. They've just announced it, but of course, they've been investing heavily in VR. They've been trying to launch their own cryptocurrency and arguably failing because they're too centralized an entity to pull it off, and rightfully so, by the way. And so, the biggest thing for me is Facebook is without a doubt here now with full intent to go into the metaverse. And they have a huge amount of data at their disposal. They have huge profiling of the global population. They've got a head start. Now, there's some good noises coming out in that press release. They mentioned decentralization, but they didn't commit to it. They mentioned cryptocurrencies, but they didn't commit to it. And they talk about openness, but to what extent can they turn the tanker? Because it would effectively require them to, totally flip their business model on its head. So I would say, I think people underestimate Facebook and the role it's already playing in the metaverse and defining the metaverse.
Yes, indeed. And for various reasons, that should worry us slightly. But, and kind of on a related note, if we zoom out and get slightly weird for a little bit, maybe it is not related, but what do you see as the long-term future for the human race, Jamie? Do you see dystopia or utopia on a long enough timeline?
Oh, God. I'm an optimist in many senses. You wouldn't be an early stage investor if you weren't. But at the same time, I'm a realist. I'm reasonably well enough versed in history, and history rhymes. And so on the one hand, I'm very hopeful that there is both the opportunity but also the incentive for the open metaverse, for the metaverse to become more open. And I think as a minimum requirement, I think that will have a positive impact on society for humanity. That said, does that stop wars and human nature? I don't know. And of course, one of the things that I do wrestle with is, I'm generally pro privacy. I'm pro censorship resistance, and because I live in the UK. Generally, we can trust our government. I say generally, but it's not the same as living in China or South Africa now, right? And or Cuba or wherever. And so I believe that we need these systems that can resist governments. At the same time, does it concern me that anybody can communicate online freely and generate income and transfer money around at the same time? I'm a father, and of course we all know there's some horrific things that happen on the internet. And so, there's a really interesting, there's a comedy show here in the UK. I actually forget the name of the sketch show, but it has one of the guys from the Peep Show on it, and it's two Nazis in a room, and one of them turns around to the other one and says, "Do you think we're the bad guys?" And that kind of, it kind of brings it home, right? So I try to be balanced in not thinking that a lot of the design principles that I'm championing to exist in the metaverse, they are imperfect, right? And there are contradictions and there are conflicts that will come about from them, and many of them will be unpredictable, and some of them will be very predictable, yet still inevitable.
Love that example of the comedy sketch show, and of course that's a meme now. Of course, I've seen a few variations on that line. You mean we're the bad guys, and kind of memes, and you could apply that to the US in many situations. You could apply that to companies like Facebook and Amazon and Google and Apple even in many situations as well. But it's time to close this out, Jamie. Let's start to finish this off. The final question in the Crypto Conversation Hot Take Round is, and this should be interesting to hear what you've got to say, what is your favorite science fiction book, film, show, or universe?
My most famous movie, more recently, was Interstellar, just because, as a father to a young child, that kind of, God, I was sobbing uncontrollably, but I also loved everything about it, the sound design, and I loved how it approached the future. But of course, you have to go to Space Odyssey 2001 and stuff like that. I'm more of a sci-fi movie fan than I am of the literature. But of course, I actually revisited Snow Crash recently, and it's a great read, and of course very humorous as well.
Yes, brilliant. All right, well, got to give shout outs to Snow Crash, of course. This has been a surprising amount of fun. Jamie, we've gone deep into the metaverse today. Nothing else to say really except to hand the metaphorical microphone back to you. And look, really just any kind of final shout outs to, Outlier or anything that you want to give. I guess tell the people where they can go to find you on your various platforms and where they should go to find out more about the Outlier ecosystem and your various theses and investments and accelerator programs and so on.
Yeah, so I try to avoid giving any shout outs to any one particular startup in the portfolio, just because we've got so many now. I'm bound to offend more than I could please. But what I would say is if you go to outlierventures.io, you can see our portfolio there. As I said, we'll accelerate 100 startups this year in the Open Metaverse, whether they're working in NFTs or DeFi, at all layers of the stack, from Metaverse native couture brands to avatar marketplaces to people building decentralized gaming engines. It's really the kind of spectrum of what's possible. And we kind of have these quarterly events. One just passed, which we call Diffusion events, and they're open events. We do them every quarter. It's when our latest cohort graduates, and we bring together our wider ecosystem, which includes the likes of people like Epic Games and Microsoft, not just kind of the hardcore Web3 natives, to discuss the Open Metaverse. And so I'd highly recommend people join us there. And then we have a podcast which was previously called Founders of Web3, which had all the top founders from across Web3, which is now called the Metaverse Show. And so, if you like the kind of themes that I was talking about today, definitely subscribe there or go to the YouTube channel. I think it's just youtube.com/Outlier Ventures. But other than that, and it's been a pleasure coming on. I can't believe we've blown through an hour, but it's a real pleasure chatting to you, and thanks for having me on.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jamie. All the best, and bye for now.
Thanks.
All right, there you go. That was Jamie Burke from Outlier Ventures. And man, we went deep there. He can talk all things metaverse, that is for sure. Do recommend you go to, I think it's outlierventures.io, is that? Let me just check. Yeah, it is. outlierventures.io, and yeah, so you can download the paper that we talked about, the Open Metaverse framework. That's a good read. I read through that yesterday in preparation for this podcast. A lot of smart thinking in there. And yeah, it's just fascinating to see different people, different firms beginning to kind of publish, their kind of, deeper frameworks for approaching the metaverse. And so there's a few different people doing that. But yeah, Jamie and Outlier certainly one, and they are part of the conversation, leading the conversation really. So yeah, fascinating stuff. All right, better finish this off. Thanks for listening, everyone. Please don't forget to subscribe to the Crypto Conversation in whatever podcast app you are using so you can see when new episodes drop. Yeah, but that's us for today. We're out of here. Thanks again. This was the Crypto Conversation for